the word worship sometimes gets convoluted, and as I understand the etymology of the word worship, it's just simply to acknowledge the value. And you said merge. That's a unity word. That the ultimate goal in the unity movement is to come to the place where you no longer exist as a personality. I am, yes. And unity would call that the silence. I have attained the place where, as Jesus would say, the Father and I are one. There is no separation. I am living in that energy, not defining myself by the drop that I am, but by the part of the ocean that I am. Yeah. And when worship comes into the play, that's a difficult word for a lot of unity people because they've come from very worshipful histories. Yes. Where it's worshiping something outside of themselves. It's praising something that is unattainable or unreachable. And out here, unity says everything that we are wanting to bring value to exists already at the point of view. And as you wake up, there will be no longer a need to worship anything because the value will be so self-evident. The value will be, I'll be vibrating at the place of that value of oneness that I no longer have to even think about God because God's expressing at the point of where I'm at. I don't know if that's the goal of the Baha'i or if it's, and you know, I always like to laugh and say that if I have attained that, I probably wouldn't be in physical form anymore. Mm-hmm. If I'm ever going to get that, I probably have ascended already. Yes, yes. I no longer have a need for a body to learn how to relate in this energy. So unity would say our job is to not maybe attain the place of worship, but the place of complete and total oneness with everything as an expression of God.
Yeah, a couple of points. One, on the question of reaching that point, again, the seventh valley of absolute nothingness and total humility and having totally understood being worthy of being in the presence of God. So he explains it in that fashion. On the question of worship, Baha'u'llah's explanation is this, that as long as we're human, he says in man, and we have shared this with you before, in man, in human, there are two natures. There's a spiritual or higher nature, and his material or lower nature. We don't talk about sin and evil and all that kind of stuff. But he says these two natures is in all of us. And he says in one he approaches God, in the other he lives for the world alone. And what he suggests, and I guess all prophets have suggested, is that we need to seek for that higher parts of us, which is God. But then, in order to do that, to reach that, I don't know for how long, maybe, at least for this, Baha'u'llah says each revelation has a period of about 1,000 years. At least for the next 1,000 years, he makes it like all past religions as well. Makes this prayer and meditation a daily ritual requirement. But that worship. Now, of course, ultimately, like the fifth principle that you have in your fifth principle is ultimately service. Service to the humankind is the ultimate revelation of it. But in the interim period, he says at least when you wake up and when you go to bed, you need to read some holy writings and reflect on them and try to emulate what you have read and studied for the course of the day. And with that spirit, go to bed and then wake up again. So he thinks worship to be part of the requirement of the human condition to take us to the higher level.
Yeah, unity talks about the relative realm and the absolute realm. The human existence, which it would basically say is a grand illusion made up from the mind of men. That it's forever changing, it's alterable, and it is like a fog and a mist that is unreal, completely and totally unreal. And that our job, maybe the story of the prodigal son, and in that story it says, and the prodigal son came to himself, coming to the higher reality, the higher truth, our spiritual nature, which then is a remembrance of, I'm not this body, I'm not these experiences, I'm not anything of the earthly realm, I'm of a higher nature. and that the readings, again, yes, do read the words of those who have lived in that place, but then put the book down and go into the deep meditation, the silence, the stillness, the prayer, that I may also live in that place.
Yeah.
And then out of the prayer, that's our fourth principle, is the truth that I know mentally is integrated into my system through quiet meditation and prayer, and then followed up with, now I live from that place. So I enter back into the world, now getting active with my hands, my feet, my mind, and my heart, that I may be a vessel for everything I knew in the quiet and the stillness. Everything of the absolute nature that I knew to be true spiritually, I now work diligently to, so if it's oneness, I know oneness in the spiritual realms. My job is to create oneness on earth, and to pay it forward, if you will, to remind others in dialogue and discussion that we belong to each other. We're not separate. And then to live my life as a testimony to that. Otherwise, it's a bit of a waste if it stops at me.
Right.
If I know my oneness with God and with all creation, and I do nothing to demonstrate
Right.
it dies.
It's of no use.
It's of no use.
And in that respect, Baha'u'llah confirms this, and he says that work in the spirit of worship, is worship itself. So in many ways, he says maybe in past generations, for example, in Islam, they pray 5 times a day, so they stop work and go. And he says, no, if you do your work during the day, all day, that's worship. If you do it in the spirit of service. So again, that's realizing the needs of the time. You know, you can't just go every 2-3 hours and just now I have to go and pray and wash your hands and do that. He says, do it in the morning, in the evening, and in between work, but then with the spirit of worship.
Well, and I think that Unity would say, and I believe Baha'i as well, the goal is to integrate it into my life, the practice,
Yes.
whether it be 5 times a day or in the morning or in the evening. These are very, very important practices to integrate a system that the worship now becomes a state of being.
Right.
And it's not so much worship anymore, it's a recognition that when I meet or see something, or behold, or witness something beautiful and sacred, I'm not worshiping God in that event. I have an awareness that God is present right here. There's a recognition that doesn't need to be reminded in a place of prayer. Doesn't have to be reminded in doing anything, because my mind and my heart are so centered in God that when I behold anything happening here, I see the face of God.
You see the face of God. Again, in the hidden words, he mentions that several times. That because we are made in the image of God, and therefore when you see your fellow man, see the face of God in that person, and in that fashion, revive humanity to come to the higher level that they deserve to be.
So Unity would say, and let me ask this as a point of building a bridge here, is there any place where there is an exception to where that face of God can be found? Is there other than God? Unity's perspective is there is only one power, one presence, one goodness, and it's everywhere present in everybody at all times, regardless of their behaviors. Now, the behaviors will reflect that that person has forgotten that truth, that they're anchored in the relative realm, in this earthly existence, or they're anchored in a higher place. And Unity does talk about sin as simply a consciousness that believes that they were separate from anything, but the presence of God as everything. There's a separation. Is there, in the Baha'i tradition, an exception to where that God can be found?
Okay. What you said is very much confirmed in the Baha'i writings. Rather than discussing the question of good and evil, in that sense, that those people are evil, this and evil, we accept that there are bad things, there are evil things in the world, but the way Baha'u'llah explains, he particularly likes the words of light and darkness. That there's light, that everybody has the capacity, can have the capacity to seek light, but then he says some people choose to be in darkness. That is not the fault of God, that's not the fault of anybody, they just chose to be that way. But then he says, when you see darkness, don't curse the darkness. shed some light. This is what all people of faith are supposed to do. We need to shed light. We don't condemn anybody, any human being, because they're still made in the image of God. Even that terrorist a few days ago in Florida, or 50 years ago, Hitler, but we talked about that some time ago. They're still children of the same God, but they're in darkness.
Is darkness the absence of God?
Darkness is absence of light, and darkness is where God is not. God is everywhere, but then God is light. So again, this is how a small human being like me can visualize it. That okay, there's darkness, that means that light is not shining on it, that God is not shining on it, but then that light can shine on it, but then he's hiding himself, like a mouse in a place.
So unity, we're, I think, very much in alignment here, would say the light is there,
Yeah.
but it has been forgotten. Or perhaps the eyes are shut. There's no light here. There's
Right.
no light here. And that the job is to shift my perspective such that I open up and realize that light was there all the time. It says in the Older Testament, in the Jewish scriptures, the Torah, there's talking, I think it was Jacob, who woke from a dream and said, surely God was here, and I did not know it. That if there is an absence of light, evil, unity would say, is not that there's an energy counter to the good.
Right.
It's just
Yes.
evil is I've forgotten the truth.
Yes,
I'm
yes.
blinded to the truth, and it's the old hymn, I once was blind, but now I see.
Now I see.
And that the true awakening of humanity is opening our eyes,
Yes.
opening our hearts to know that God was there all along, and my job, always as a spiritual seeker, is to behold that light, and to see that.
We see it eye to eye.